Hi everyone! Welcome to Design Armoire. We made Calcolites available here in the Philippines through Design Armoire. We want Filipinos to have an access to world-class, elegant lights that are known all over the world. It's Pinoy pride at its best, and we're very proud to showcase these pieces at Design Armoire. Whether you want to redo your home or just spruce up some spaces, Design Armoire is here for your handcrafted needs and luxurious pieces that are within reach. Come by the store and let your design inspiration come to life. Design Armoire, luxury you can afford.
Isla Pugad is an island community in Hagonoy, Bulacan, which thrives on fishing as their main source of livelihood. It is around 1.5 to 2-hour drive from Metro Manila, plus a 30 to 45-minute boat ride from the mainland. Challenges that this community face are overpopulation, lack of urban planning, lack of resilient structures, and continuously affected by multiple hazards due to climate change like land subsidence, flooding, sea rise level, tsunami, among others.
Grupo po kami ng mga arkitekto ng Pilipinas na mula sa Makati. So, through Miss Pamela, nabigyan niya po kami ng oportunidad na para ipaalam sa amin kung paano at ano ang kondisyon ng ating lugar. So ngayon, kaya kami ngayon andito para bigyan kayo ng konti na tulong or itong regalo na galing sa aming grupo. Sana po, sa itong napagtandaan namin, maging masaya kayo ngayong Pasko pag galing sa amin.
We can make difference to the lives of these people. Let's capitalize on our expertise to make communities like Istapugad to improve their built environments and make the lives of these people better. Maraming salamat sa mga tumulong at wag po tayo magsawa na tumulong sa ating mga kapwa.
Hi everyone! Welcome to Design Armor. We made Calcolites available here in the Philippines through Design Armor. We want Filipinos to have an access to world-class, elegant lights that are known all over the world. It's Pinoy pride at its best, and we're very proud to showcase these pieces at Design Armor. Whether you want to redo your home or just spruce up some spaces, Design Armor is here for your handcrafted needs and luxurious pieces that are within reach. Come by the store and let your design inspiration come to life. Design Armor, luxury you can afford.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the UAP Harmony Prayer, the Philippine National Anthem, the UAP March, and the Architect's Credo. We enjoin everyone to sing and recite, in unison.
O Lord, we cry for peace. Purify our eyes to see peace. Purify our minds to understand peace.
Linisin niyo ang aming puso upang mahalin ang kapayapaan. Linisin niyo ang aming diwa upang maabot ang kapayapaan.
Ang kapayapaang nagmumula sa iyong pagmamahal at pag-unawa.
O Ginoo, palig-una ang among pananaw sa kalinaw. Giniyahan sa imong inspirasyon. Bisan og aduna kay daghang pamaagi sa pagpadayeg sa imong presensya, ang estilo nimo kanunay. Kay ikaw mipadayon sa imong pakigsulti kanamong tanan. Kanunay kang nag-atiman kanamong tanan.
Kamidan na kam o ako, apagilasinan ti kapyam, nagbibiyag akan kanayon, ang makipatpatang ken ka.
Sa pagintiende sang imo pagkahipos kag presensya, sa paagi sang istoryahanay sa amon nga kaugalingon para matukiban namon ang buot silingon sang kabuhi.
Ing pakipagtalamitam karing aliwa, ban misulong king masampat aparalan ding sabla.
Tawi kami sa muyang kagurangnan, nin kusog, tanganing mabuhay sa pag-urolay, sa tahaw nin pagkabaranga masindai pagkakasirinabot.
And to build peace with all people of sincere hearts who believe in love and compassion. Amen.
United Architects of the Philippines are we, sworn to uphold our profession's dignity. Ours is to create, to design and plan, with a shadow for the family of man. As architects we build with artistry and vision, become of our vocation and dedication. By His strength, utility, and beauty, in the simple lives of compensation. I shall work with this general objective that I am accountable to God, to Mother Earth, to my country, to my fellow men, and to myself. I shall uphold the ideals and follow the norms and ethical conduct of this noble profession. I shall pursue moral and professional excellence to the utmost level of integrity, through industrious dedication and meaningful application to my work that merits a reputation for quality of services worthy of fair remuneration. I shall pledge myself to the highest standard of professionalism in relation to clients, colleagues, industry partners, and society. I shall dedicate myself to the pursuit of creative endeavor towards the goal of enlightened art and science, generously sharing it. I shall respect the rights and works of my colleagues in the profession and confine my comments to constructive intents. I shall endeavor to do my duty in the protection of our common environment and the preservation of architectural heritage for the sake of the present and future generations. So help me God.
Please give them and their loved ones fortitude in overcoming these trials and finding their true happiness. Please protect and guide our confidence. Keep them tirelessly attend and help all UAP. Fill them in your love that they may remain safe and continuous in their lives. We pray for the one another. We may show compassion for the sick and in need. May we find it in our hearts to reach out, share, and uplift one another, not only in these trying times, but in all times. We offer our prayer for those whose lives were lost because of this pandemic, for our fallen doctors, nurses, and all frontliners who fought this disease to the very end. For the countless people whose lives have been threatened, our friends, colleagues, family, and loved ones, we wait for every professional life. Open your loving arms to them now. May we especially remember in this day and age of the pandemic and everything, the selfless effort and dedication in the needs of humanity. Who in his kindness found ways to provide and help those in need. Those are dedicated or dedicated, sponsor service or benefited service by us, administration directors, and the officers of the same, and by the membership and everyone who supports in 2025. Let us now offer a moment, remembering those in need, Hello and welcome UAP Makati chapter. My name is Lalaine Fortunado and it's my honor to be your MC for today's webinar entitled Natural Resilience Towards Nature-Based Methods in Disaster Risk Management. This will be our seventh and last GMM for this fiscal year 2020-2021. And to give you an idea of our webinar for this afternoon, here's the brief flow of the program. We will be having our guest speakers discuss natural resilience and exploring an integrated approach to disaster risk management. Let me just also highlight that we will be having our business meeting at the later part of the webinar. We'll also have a raffle from our generous sponsor. So for our members, make sure you'll stay until the end of the program before we wrap everything up. All right. So for those of you just joining us, welcome. We're also live on our Facebook page at United Architects of the Philippines Makati chapter. All right. So to officially open our activities for today, ladies and gentlemen, our chapter
Thank you, Lalaine. Magandang hapon sa lahat. During our last Archicultura talk, we explored the safeguarding of our cultural identities with the influx of urban development, as well as protecting and valuing the legacies of our history through built heritage conservation. This afternoon, we will talk about resiliency, a trait which Filipinos are known for. Geographically, the Philippines is marred by various factors, may it be unpredictable earthquakes or devastating typhoons. And with this, we'll learn and adapt to the situation and rise from it. Resiliency enables us to develop mechanisms to protect us from experiences that could be beyond what we imagine. And likewise, maintain the balance in our lives as well as in our environment. As architects, we design and utilize spaces that aim to solve various challenges. With that end in mind, we must ask, how can we design structures that adapt with their environment and sustain life? And how can we solve challenges without creating new ones? These are the questions we aim to answer as we talk about natural resilience in today's discussion. On top of the webinar this afternoon, we approach the end of another fiscal year with the chapter board of directors sharing our feats and milestone for the year, as well as discussion on the proposed chapter code of policies that will aid our members as well as the next leaders of the chapter. With all of these objectives this afternoon, allow me to officially open the 7th Archicultura Talk and Business Meeting and our last General Membership Meeting for this fiscal year. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, Architect Sai. Okay, so now to acknowledge our esteemed guests, may I present to you our Vice President for Programs, Architect Shigella Villanueva.
Thank you, Elaine. So UAP Makati chapter would like to acknowledge the presence of the following guests. Speakers Pamela Kahilig, Dr. Misaka Hitirachi, past presidents Architect Elwin Benaventura, Architect Larry Carandang, Architect Jaime Hermogenes, Architect Jose Ricky Martinez, Architect Philip Recto, and Architect Nanette Segovia.
Okay, thank you po, Ms. Shiki. All right, so the UAP Makati chapter would like to thank the sponsor for this event, Design of More. Luxury you can afford. For those who are interested, you may contact them through this number or email them at info@designarmoire.com. You may also visit their showroom at Unit 103 CVI Building, Tagaytay, Santa Rosa Road. For more details, you may check out their social media platforms on Facebook, Instagram, Google+, and
Pinterest. So before we get started, I'm going to go through some housekeeping to ensure you can interact with us and the speakers. So firstly, kindly be reminded of the proper Zoom etiquette by putting your mics on mute. Should you have any questions, kindly post it on the comment box and we would have it brought up during our Q&A portion. We will also be launching polls throughout today's webinar. So we invite you to participate by selecting your responses when they appear on your screens. All right, so my dear colleagues, make yourselves comfortable because we will now be starting the talk of our keynote speaker and guest speaker for this afternoon. And here to brief us more of them, Architect Rita de la Cruz.
Good afternoon, fellow architects, friends, and guests. It is my honor and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for today. He is a civil and environmental engineer by training and holds a PhD in environmental planning and policy from the University of Queensland, Australia. He is a World Wildlife Fund Fellow based in Sri Lanka who supports the WWF Environment and Disaster Management Program. He was a project manager for the WWF and American Red Cross Partnership in Sri Lanka from 2008 to 2010 and served as environmental advisor for the UN Emergency Shelter Cluster following the Haiti earthquake in 2010 and Typhoon Haiyan Philippines in 2013. He also conducted GRRT training in Nepal following the 2015 earthquake. Currently, he is actively engaged in teaching and research on environmental planning and policy in Sri Lanka and Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Misaka Hetiarachi. Our guest speaker is a cultural anthropologist who stumbled into the field of design by doing postgraduate research in fashion, identity, and nationalism. She holds degrees in BA Communication Research and MA Anthropology from the University of the Philippines. She is also a PhD candidate at the Humanitarian Architecture Research Bureau at the School of Architecture and Urban Design of RMIT University in Melbourne. After finishing her MA in anthropology, she became the co-founder and executive research director of Curiosity Design Research, an independent ethnographic design research and consultancy firm in Manila that works with NGOs, private sector, and government agencies to develop more meaningful and useful products and services. With her career spanning 2 decades, she has background in cultural anthropology, design research, and strategic communications planning applied to fields such as post-disaster recovery, women's rights and education, community architecture, human-centered design, and urban design. Fellow architects and friends, please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Ms. Pamela Kahil.
Hi, Misaka. Yeah, you could probably start with your presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Sai. Sorry, I was waiting for the go ahead. First of all, thanks for that. Can you all hear me clearly?
Yes, sir.
Yes, yes.
First of all, thanks for that very generous introduction. And I'll take this opportunity to thank the United Architects of Philippines for giving us this opportunity to present you in such an important event in your calendar. And as you may have heard from the introduction, this is not our first time, my unit's first time in engaging with Philippines. We did have a short stint in the Philippines after Cyclone Han in 2013 in terms of improving the environmental management of Cyclone Han reconstruction process. But this is quite a different type of work that we do to when compared to the work we do in disaster reconstruction. To give you an idea about my unit in WWF, which is World Wildlife Fund, as you may all know, the panda guys, right? My unit is a fairly small program in the WWF, headquartered in the Washington, D.C. office. It's called Environment and Disaster Management Program, or the EDM program. We look at different aspects of disaster and environment nexus, where disasters and environment interact, whether it's post-disaster reconstruction or pre-disaster. Talk about today in flood risk management largely comes under the disaster reconstruction, disaster risk reduction purview, like the preparedness, the planning that we have to do before a flood occurs, before a disaster occurs, to prepare for it and to minimize the risks. I will put on my presentation. Can you see it?
Yes, Ms. Akai, we can.
Yeah, the slides are visible, right? Okay. So as I said, our work on flood risk management comes mainly under a project called the Flood Green Guide. Just to give you a very brief history of how WWF, an organization which people know as like a heavily conservation-oriented organization, right? Some people actually call us tree huggers, right? And how did we end up in the flood business? As I said, we already had a program on called this Environment and Disaster Management, which looks at the nexus of environment and disaster. And in 2012, USAID approached WWF to asking us to develop a guideline for natural and nature-based methods for flood risk management. The argument was when they fund flood risk management programs throughout the world, always, no matter who the stakeholders are, whether it's private sector or government sector stakeholders or implementers, or whether it's NGOs, they said that there is a tendency of always ending up in hard engineering methods, like dams or levees, something types of structures which are like very concrete heavy, highly engineered, and in most cases damaging to the environment. But then they wanted to inquire, like, why is this? Are there any other methods, more environmentally friendly methods available in flood risk management. And they found actually there were, and that's why they wanted us to develop a guideline to incorporate, give the necessary information to the flood risk managers or the flood managers about these natural and nature-based methods. But when we got into the business, we quickly found out that there's enough information already available. Most of it is available free through the internet. So then came the question, why, if it is, the information is widely available, why is it not being used? Why aren't people using natural and nature-based methods in flood risk management as frequently as they use hard engineering methods? So then we found actually, after looking into the matter for more than 1 year, although there are methods available, although there's enough information, fairly good information available. I'm not saying it's good enough, but it's fairly good. But there is a discrepancy, right? There's a gap between the available information and incorporating that into the decision making in the flood risk management sector or the flood management sector, because it's a very structured form of, it's a very structured process making flood risk management decisions, right? Choosing the methods for flood risk management. Normally, these the flood risk management projects cost a lot of money, and that involves a lot of economic cost and benefit analysis and engineering designs and so on. So it's very structured. So there was a difficulty actually. The main gap, the main difficulty we saw was incorporating these natural and nature-based methods into the structured decision-making process of flood risk management. And that's what we tried to do with this book, to help the decision makers, especially the middle-level decision makers, the flood engineers, the city planners, architects, disaster management officials at regional, district, and local levels, community leaders, NGO leaders, these middle-level decision makers, help them to incorporate natural and nature-based methods in their flood risk management decision making. And that's where I think we are really delighted to engage with an organization like yours, which is an institute of architects, an organization of architects. Architects get involved in many flood-related fields, both knowingly and unknowingly. Like each house design you do, has a flood risk to it, right? Each neighborhood that you may design as a urban designer, right, urban planner, has a flood risk. In most cases, would have a flood risk at some point in time associated with it. So architecture, we understand as a profession which is heavily entangled, heavily connected, and heavily relevant to flood risk management. So before going into discussing what are these methods, why are natural and nature-based methods important in flood risk management, how it would really connect to the natural resilience, the theme of this discussion today, right? Theme of this workshop today. How it would connect to natural resilience as a whole of the landscape, right? First, let's try to understand the concept of risk. Okay, so I'll try to start with a question here, right, to get certain doubts off the table. This is my first question. Should flood risk management strive to eliminate all kinds of floods? Is that the main objective of floods, eliminating floods? Can we launch the poll here? Just answer quickly, don't think too much about it. I want your gut reaction. while you are voting, you can also put your opinions in the chat box. Why you think that is important? Why do you think, I mean, if you voted yes, why do you think it is important to eliminate all the floods, right? To be safe, to be flood resilient. And also, if you answered no, why don't you think that it's not necessary to eliminate all the floods to be flood resilient or flood safe? I see it's a tight competition between yes and no right now. The audience is almost divided half and half. So any views, please put in the chat box. I can see one response saying from Patrick Lara saying yes, to be safe. So to have that sense of safety, we have to eliminate all the floods. Okay, I think we can close the polling now and see the results. Okay, so it's a tight competition. 51% saying yes, 49% saying no, right? And I get the answers. It's a close call between the two. Yeah, so answers, and I get like from, sorry, I might not be, from Jamie. The answer is, for me, no, because there are areas where we should let nature take its course. Okay. And then there's another answer. I think flood control is much better than total elimination. In Malaysia, they even design a flood road network where the flood is flood is controlled through the network. No, because floods with high risk to the residential areas and the people are need tending to. And then there's another answer. Palad Christian, yes, floods in urban areas bring problems such as traffic congestion and so on. Okay, so we have opinions to both sides, right? Inclined to both options, yes and no. But before giving an answer, let's go to our presentation. Let's look at some basic principles of flood risk management and the concept of risk. So our view as the Environment and Disaster Management Program of the WWF and the Flood Green Guide team is that not all floods are bad. So this might partially answer the question. Why? We all know historically communities have considered, treated floods as a blessing. Right? I mean, we all know that in the Nile, right, in Egypt, like probably the most ancient, great civilization that we know, and probably it was the same in Babylon or the Sumerian cultures. They treated the Nile as a god, right? And what's the biggest gift that they got from the Nile god, the river god? That was floods, because it brought them water, it brought them nourishment, and they depended on the the nutrition brought in by the floods annually to grow the next season. It's not only a thing of history. If we go to places like Bangladesh or the West Bengal, India, their agriculture still, the communities are heavily dependent on the nutrients and water brought by annual floods of the Ganges river for their agriculture. And it's a thriving agriculture. It's one of the biggest agricultural areas in the world, and has one of the highest agricultural productivity in terms of like real wealth and nutrient generation. Even in places like ancient South America, floods were very creatively used to increasing productivity, like the raised bed agriculture. There are enough examples of raised bed agriculture in the Asian region as well, where you use floodwaters and the nutrition brought by floodwaters to water your fields within the floodplain just by raising your crops growing your crops in raised beds. Now, this brings a question. Okay, then why do we consider floods always as a disaster? Does flooding always cause a disaster? What is a disaster? Right? A disaster is a serious disruption of the society, causing widespread human, material, or environmental losses that exceed the ability of the affected society to cope using its own resources. Oh, if this is the definition of a disaster, let's look at this picture, right? This is a flood, a massive flood covering a huge area, a land area. Do you see any of these, any of the things mentioned in the above definition, right? Material or environmental losses, widespread human suffering, nothing here. This is a flood in the Amazon River, Amazon region of Brazil. And this happens every year. No one considered this as a disaster because it's a natural process. Right? Floods are extremely important ecological processes. It's not that it's good. It's good that floods happen. It's an additional benefit. It's an essential ecological process in many watersheds and ecosystems. We can't do without floods. So floods are not always disasters. Flooding is an essential part of ecosystems. Many communities, even still around the world, think of floods as beneficial. As some of you have pointed out, it's our urban cultures, right? Heavily urbanized, unsustainable cultures who are looking at floods always as disasters. I'm not saying floods were not disasters to pre-capitalist or pre-modern societies. They were. But in most cases, people knew how to live with them. It's in our modern urban societies that the attitude towards floods has changed to viewing it always as a disaster. But the floods are undoubtedly hazardous. There is a hazard in floods. Floods can be hazards. Floods can be considered as a hazard to human communities. Okay, so then what's the difference between a hazard and a disaster, right? Hazard is something which can potentially cause human or environmental damage. As an example, a scissor lying in the floor, right? Just because a scissor is on the floor, it doesn't mean it's a disaster. It causes a damage. By just lying in the floor, it doesn't cause damage. But it's a hazard. It can cause damage. Its ability to cause damage to individuals or communities can depend on their vulnerability and their capacity, right? Different vulnerability of different communities and different individuals to different hazards are very different, right? Like elderly people can be more vulnerable to a particular type of hazard than young, healthy people, right? Children could be more vulnerable. So at certain disadvantaged communities could be more vulnerable. And certain communities may have capacities that they have developed over a period that can deal with like some extreme types of hazards in a very resilient way, right? So some of you might have come across such capacity, especially in the traditional knowledge of people. Right? Some indigenous communities have this remarkable ability of living with hazards, floods, droughts, cyclones, in their very primitive ways of living. They're remarkably resilient. So vulnerabilities and capacities determine whether a hazard becomes a disaster. If the vulnerabilities are high, there is a higher potential of a hazard becoming a disaster, right? Like somebody cutting themselves by stepping on the scissor or mishandling the scissor. It depends on their vulnerabilities and capacity. So every hazard doesn't become a disaster by itself. It's based on how it is managed. Just to give you an example, taking the floods. I believe this is a photo from Manila, if I'm not mistaken. If you take this photo, I mean, definitely there's a flood hazard in this area. Right? Just by looking at it, you can see. But is it going to be disastrous to everyone? Now, if you look at the people living in these high-rise buildings, right, number one, their flood exposure would be low, right? Because water won't rise all the way up to the 13th floor, right? Even if it does, right, their ability to cope with such a situation, right? They might have better ways of evacuation. They might have financial capacity to repair their houses, right? Even after flooding, their health would be much better. Nutrition would be much better to deal with the health hazards of flooding. But if we compare this to these houses, right, which are just at the bank, right, at the periphery of the water body, they are highly exposed, right? Even the smallest flood can get into them. And also they are highly vulnerable because their houses are not strong enough to withstand the flood. They won't have enough money to repair them, right? When the flood goes back, and their health might be could be much more vulnerable than the people who are living in better economic conditions. And there are other intermediate houses, right, where exposure could be high, but they might have like better living conditions to deal with the floods. So the same flood, sometimes even the same exposure level, depending on the vulnerability, the risk changes between individuals, among individuals and communities. So this is a very, very important thing that we have to keep in mind in flood risk management. Our task is to transform the vulnerabilities in a community to capacities to deal with the flood risk. When you turn vulnerabilities to capacities, the flood risk is reduced. So necessarily, the flood height doesn't have to be controlled, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily reduced to decrease the vulnerability, as we saw in this picture, right? The task is to reduce the vulnerability and increase the capacities, and then the risk would be reduced. To understand this better, we have to understand that flooding is happening in a watershed, right? It's a system, right? Flooding doesn't happen spontaneously or randomly, right? It happens in this system, what we call a watershed. A watershed is a geographical area where all the water falls into that area can be naturally collects into a single waterway and single outlet to the sea. Could be single, could be multiple, but it all collects to a particular waterway, right? And the processes within this watershed actually determine what are the types of floods you get, how severe that would be, and what are the frequencies that you get, and what are the risks in it. So the risks are distributed along a watershed. Like a watershed can have upper watershed areas with mountains, middle watershed areas, coastal watershed areas with beaches and wetlands and so on. And the watershed is actually a eco-social system, right? There is the physical system, which is the landscape, the geology, the topography, and the climate, right? What we call the water cycle, right? And then we have the biological systems, the forests, the wetlands, the dunes, the beaches, the river, and so on, right? And then we have the social systems, the cities, the villages, governing systems, social norms, customs, culture, and so on, right? And all these interact in creating floods, and floods can affect all these systems as well, right? So we have to think about floods as a system, right? A process that is happening in a system called a watershed. Now, the risk is not only distributed among within the watershed, it is also uncertain. Right? We can't know for sure what the risk is. Right? The best example for this uncertainty is climate change. Right? Now, more and more, it's becoming very difficult to predict when the rain is going to happen, what are its intensities, for how long it will persist. More extreme events are happening. I mean, Philippines is one of the countries which is bearing the brunt of this, right? So it has become not only risk is spread over the watershed, it's also uncertain over time now, right? Okay, so keeping these idea of risk, right, flood risk in mind, there are certain management principles that can improve our flood risk management, not just limiting it to hard engineering methods, not just limiting it to reducing, bringing the flood height down or controlling the floods or eliminating the floods, but managing the risk in an integrated way. Number one, risk has to be managed at different scales, right? Certain risks like overland floods, major riverine floods would happen at a watershed scale. Flash floods that we know in urban areas can happen in a floodplain scale, right? And then at floodplain scale, there can be other risks such as the transportation system being disrupted, right? Electrical systems being disrupted. These are also flood-related risks. Certain flood risks can emerge at the community scale, like damage to crops and epidemics spreading, right? And then at the household scale, there are risks like damages to the houses, individuals getting sick in the households, and individual deaths, right? So these risks has to be managed at different scales. And then the best approach to manage these risks is to understand these risks with risk assessments first and develop flood risk management objectives, clear flood risk management objectives. What is the risk that we are going to address, right? What is the problem? What is the risk we are going to address, and how should we change it, right? When it comes to flood risk management objectives, right, there are two approaches to manage the risk. One, as you mentioned earlier, like half of you agreed with, is to bring down the flood flow, bring down the flood water that is coming into a floodplain, right, or flowing through a floodplain. So that is managing the flood hazard. The second approach is, instead or along with managing the hazard, change the vulnerability and change in the capacity of the communities that are facing that flood. That is actually adapting to floods, not necessarily changing the flood magnitude, not the flows, but adapting to floods. Management principle 3, you can't do flood management without community engagement. Community engagement at all stages of flood management is really important, right? It is important in the assessment stage to gather data. In your design stage, it builds relationships, and you can do community-based designs. And then through flood management, you can empower communities, and also you need the community support to disseminate the knowledge as well. So community engagement is very important, and I think in our last session, Pamela would look into this aspect more in detail. Management principle 4, there should be multiple benefits of flood risk management projects. One big problem with high engineered flood risk management, hard flood risk management, is that those projects are only designed to reduce the flood. There are no other benefits of that, right? There might be other, multi-purpose dam schemes and all that, but in general, a levee, a pump house, growing, those hard engineering measures doesn't create any other benefits. In that, as opposed to that, certain natural and nature-based methods can generate other benefits like livelihood benefits. If you revegetate an upper watershed, it creates livelihood opportunities. It creates environmental benefits, right? Like carbon sequestration, supporting biodiversity, and so on. So there should be you should always strive to create multiple benefits of a flood risk management project. Management principle 5, combined methods. There are 3 types of flood risk management methods. Non-structural methods, methods which do not need any physical intervention, like zoning of a urban area, right? Land use planning, flood preparedness, right? Flood warning systems. None of these need any physical infrastructure on ground. It doesn't change the environment. So they should be taken as the first priority. Whatever can be solved with a non-structural method, you don't have to go for any structural method. The second, soft and green structural methods. We would talk about this much later, in much detail in the second session. Right? These are methods like restoring wetlands, green roofs, blue roofs, green walls, swales, upper watershed conservation, which are structural methods which need physical interventions on ground, but doesn't need much heavy engineering. So this should be considered, in our view, should be considered as the second priority, right, in our priorities. If you can't manage a flood risk just with non-structured methods, first consider the soft or green structural methods. Then comes the hard and gray structural methods, the methods that we know very well, dams, levees, pump houses, and so on. Hard structural methods, which necessarily create negative environmental impacts. But sometimes the floods can be so difficult and so big, and the properties that we have to protect might be so significant. So we might have to actually use structural methods. We are not against it, but take it as the third priority. Okay, so to finish off, sorry, this should be question 2. I'll put another question. Can we launch the poll? The question is, flood risk management projects should first prioritize saving lives, protecting property, and reducing poverty before considering environmental issues. So is that the priority in flood risk management? Should we differentiate between them? Right. In the same way, please go ahead and put your views in the chat box so that I can read a couple of them. Yeah. So please go ahead and put your ideas in the chat box. So I get one answer already. No, it's from Patrick Lara saying no, it should go side by side. So dealing with these human concerns like saving lives and protecting property, reducing poverty, should go side by side with environmental issues. Any other reactions? You can also raise your hands now and I get another answer, a comment from Peñalosa. No, because when environment factors are prioritized, every positive impact to the community follows. Okay. So another one saying the management should be as a whole. I think we can close the poll now and show the results. Yeah. Again, it's a very close call between the two. 49% saying yes and 51% saying no. So the class is divided half and half on whether the human life-saving and economic issues should be prioritized over environmental issues in flood risk management. And I get another answer saying from Palad, no, environmental issues affect every person, so protecting environment first also in a way saves lives. Yes. So I agree with all the comments in the chat box right now. That's what we say as well, our point of view as well. Actually, environmental management is saving lives, as we have seen, like in the very quick overview that we did through this in this presentation. Actually, floods are generated. It's an environmental process, right? How the floods flow, what's their frequency, right? How intense they are actually determined by environmental factors. So environmental sustainability, right? Proper environmental management is actually part of life saving. It is part of economic sustainability and economic prosperity of a given landscape. And that's the idea that we want to convey with the Flood Green Guide, that you can't subcontract environmental management. It's a very common notion, right? Although people don't admit it freely, especially among us, like technical people, like engineers or architects or host managers, procurement managers. They think environment is something like we are kind of trained to think, right? That is environmental management is something secondary, right? After we gain environmental prosperity, right? Then we can think about environment, like the West did, right? First, they devastated their environments, cut their forests and everything, and then gained economic prosperity through that. And now they can sit down and relax and take care of their environment. That's actually a very wrong perspective. The damages done to the environments in North America or Europe or the former Soviet Union are irreversible. They are still suffering a lot from those issues, and even the small gains that they have achieved is at the cost of the now developing countries, because most of the industries have been relocated to the developing countries, and most of the population growth is now happening in the developing countries. So it's not that environmental problems have been solved in the West, in North America or Europe. It has actually just shifted to another place on the same ecosystem of the Earth. So anything happening anywhere is going to impact the ecosystem of the Earth and going to impact everyone as a whole. So I'm really happy that we are getting answers along the same line. So ultimately, this is the philosophy that we follow, which is called the integrated flood risk management concept. It's an internationally accepted concept. It's a process which promotes the coordinated management and development of water, land, and related resources in order to maximize the resultant economic and social welfare in an equitable manner without compromising the sustainability of vital ecosystems, right? So that's what we are trying to answer. How can we do this? How can we develop the water resources and land resources, minimizing the risks of the floods, but without compromising the ability of the vital ecosystem? So with this, I'll actually quickly go through again a little bit about the book, the Flood Green Guide. It's available free. You can request for a copy from our website, envirodm.org. I will send the link in a minute. The book actually tries to develop a framework which allows the middle-level decision makers to incorporate natural and nature-based methods, to think differently about flood risk management throughout the flood risk management decision cycle, whether it's preliminary assessment or objective development, selecting of the methods, operation or monitoring, or project evaluation. It provides details about 29 flood risk management methods: structural, non-structural, soft structural, and hard structural. It describes them not in detail, not giving design details or anything like that, but just in general, providing easy to understand illustration and so on. And also provide some tools like tables, worksheets, and so on, that would allow you to easily incorporate natural and nature-based methods into your decision making. Okay, so that's the end of the first session. Are we taking a small break with this, or should I just proceed to the second session directly?
We could probably,
because
we could probably have like a minute or two break.
Yeah, that's good, I think. Yeah. I noticed I've run out. I've kind of spilled over a little bit into the second session. I'm short on time, but anyway, I'll try to catch up with that in the second one. Yeah, so we'll take about a 1 or 2 minute break, Sai?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, welcome to Design Armoire. We made Calcolites available here in the Philippines through Design Armoire. We want Filipinos to have an access to world-class, elegant lights that are known all over the world. It's Pinoy pride at its best, and we're very proud to showcase these pieces at Design Armoire. Whether you want to redo your home or just spruce up some spaces, Design Armoire is here for your handcrafted needs and luxurious pieces that are within reach. Come by the store and let your design inspiration come to life. Design Armoire, luxury you can afford.
Hi, Misaka. Maybe we could continue with your second session.
Right. Thank you very much. And sorry, that. I have this. I have to apologize for the bad lighting condition in my room. I want to make that point earlier as well. It's actually, I'm working on it, but I still couldn't get it because there's a window to my right, and because of the light coming on from that side, it's really difficult to maintain the light inside my room. So I'm really sorry about the light condition, and of course, my skin color also doesn't help much in in that. So I'll try to keep smiling. So you can see
we understand,
part of me. Right. Yeah. So okay. Going into the second session, first I will, if there are any quick questions from the first session, we can go into that. Anything critical? We'll have a quick question. We'll have a Q&A session later as well. But if there's anything that you want to clarify immediately, you can put it on the chat box or just raise your hands. Right. At any time, please feel free to put any question in the chat box. I'll try to answer. And of course, later we'll have a Q&A session as well. Anyway, so this session. So here now we discussed about the principles that we promote through the flood green guide to incorporate natural and nature-based methods into flood risk management. So what are the methods that we can use in this sense? What are these natural and nature-based methods? So this session is kind of looking into it a little bit in detail. Before doing that, we will be giving 2 poll questions in this session as well. Normally in our standard training programs, all our classwork, all our group work is based on one single hypothetical scenario, right? A hypothetical watershed called the Green River watershed. So I'll ask 2 questions. Not as assessment, but just to keep the discussion going, like the last 2 poll questions. But this time those questions would be based on this scenario. There is a very short scenario video, which I think would also help you to get an understanding of a watershed-wide flood risk problem, right? So I'll play that, and then we can go into the presentation proper. Let me know if there's a problem in the sound, right?
Tropico is a monsoonal country with a high annual average rainfall exceeding 120 inches per year. Green River watershed has mountains in the upper watershed, rolling terrain in the middle, and highly urbanized in the lower watershed, where Tropico's largest city, Haipo, is located. Land use patterns of the Green River watershed is quite diverse. The upper watershed is dominated by tea plantations, which has historically recorded high levels of erosion and land degradation. Rubber plantations is the dominant land use in the middle watershed. Lower watershed is highly urbanized with extensive hydrological modification and loss of permeability. Impacts of floods in the watershed is also very diverse. Monsoonal floods cause massive landslides and mud flows in the mountains and regular riverine floods in the middle watershed areas. In the urbanized lower watershed areas, mainly the Haipo city, flash floods are common. Urban flash flooding has complex impacts, which disproportionately burden the poor, cause serious health and safety issues, and exacerbate the coastal pollution. Impacts of urban flooding on the marine ecosystems is yet to be understood. Some areas of Haipo city experience yearly flash flooding during the monsoon. Levels of inundation and flood impacts vary according to the area. May 2016 recorded a major flood in the city, where the flood levels rose up to 2.5 meters in some areas and displaced around 185,000 people. Riskville is a low-income community in the Haipo city. It adjoins a floodplain wetland of the Green River. It experiences flash flooding during short, high-intensity storms. The Metro Haipo flood in 2016 destroyed about 75% of the housing in Riskville, and 7 people lost their lives. From a small suburban village until 1980s, Riskville has grown into a highly dense urban settlement, expanding into the nearby wetland and causing intense sewage and solid waste-based pollution of the waterways. There is a seasonal climate variability observed in the Green River watershed. Most prominently, the El Nino and La Nina cycles, which cause alternative extreme storms and drought heat events in 7 to 5 year periods. In addition to this, climate change models suggest that in the next 30 years, there will be an increase in the precipitation magnitude by 10 to 25%, which indicates higher potential of riverine and flash flooding. During this training, you are tasked with developing a comprehensive flood risk management plan for the flood-related problems in the Green River watershed, giving special focus to the devastating losses experienced every year in the Haipo city.
So I think that presentation that video not only gives you an idea, not only introduces this particular hypothetical case, but also gives you an idea about all aspects of flood-related issues in a typical tropical watershed, right? I'm pretty sure, like when you were listening to that, you could actually relate to a number of issues that you know of with regard to floods. Okay, now with that, we go to another quick poll question. Let me share the screen. Yeah, so this is my first question. What should be the first step in addressing the flood risk in Haipo city, right? Build a large dam in the upper watershed to control the flood flow in the floodplain of Haipo city. Number 2, engage a group of experts to study and design required flood management methods. Number 3, conduct a risk assessment and develop a set of specific objectives to eliminate or reduce selected flood risks. Also, again, you can put your comments in the chat. Any comments about it? Why do you think? So we have there are like 0 votes for just building a dam in the upper watershed. I'm really happy to hear that. And then a great majority, about 70%, are right now favoring conducting a risk assessment first and setting specific objectives. And about 30% are favorable towards giving the project to a group of experts. Okay, shall we close the poll now? Yeah, so this is the result. More than 70% supporting the idea that we should first conduct a risk assessment and then develop specific objectives before selecting the methods. About 30% saying, less than 30% saying we have to engage a group of experts and they can decide the flood risk management methods. I don't see any. Okay, that is. Yeah. So I have some answers saying a study is needed to be conducted first before taking the action. Third option, I think communities can start with simple risk assessment of their vulnerabilities and potential capabilities before engaging the experts. And there's another answer, first conduct an assessment, engage the group experts, and third, build a large dam. Maybe this one, this is one option, right? Okay. So we all agree that a risk assessment is the first step. We have to understand what is our risk and then develop flood risk management. Of course, engaging experts is needed in developing methods because, you know, if you need it, whether it's non-structural, whether it's structural hard or structural soft, when they are like larger systems, when it involves large number of people, large funding sweats, then expert engagement is absolutely necessary. We are not saying that flood risk management can be done without experts, but the most important thing first is to understand the risk. Risk assessment may need, will need expert inputs as well as at the same time, along with community engagement. So it's should always be a joint effort of the community as well as experts to bring out the maximum. Right? Okay, so with that discussion, let's look into what are these methods of flood risk management? What are the options and what are the principles behind selecting them? So without exhausting you too much with my voice again and again, I'll play again. I will be doing the presentation, but doing the video, but I will play like a quick video of one of the videos that we like. I quickly play one of the videos that we use in our regular programs on flood risk management methods. Let me open it. Right. So let's see this video first. It's about 9 minutes, and then I'll go through just a couple of slides on certain flood risk management, soft structural flood risk management methods, which might be of particular interest for you as architects, and then we'll go into do another discussion, right? Here we go. Again, tell me if there's a problem with the sound.
Hi all. In this session, we will look at the selection of methods for a flood risk management project. As we all know, there are numerous flood risk management methods of different types and with different advantages and disadvantages. Here we will look at the important steps and principles in method identification and method selection and design stages of the Flood Green Guide framework. The Flood Green Guide discusses 29 non-structural, soft structural, and hard structural methods. Each method has its advantages and disadvantages in particular contexts, which have to be carefully understood in selecting methods according to different flood risk management objectives. As we have discussed in the principles lecture, the Flood Green Guide encourages the flood managers to prioritize the non-structural methods first, and then consider soft structural methods, and if required, as the third option, hard structural methods. Also, as we have discussed in the objective setting lecture, there are two approaches for flood risk management. First, managing the floods or managing the hazard. Second, adapting to floods or managing the vulnerability and the capacity. As you can see in the slide, there are two approaches to managing floods as well. A, reducing the flood flow which comes into a floodplain through reducing runoff or increasing storage. B, managing the flood flow or how the flood flows within a floodplain, example by improving the conveyance of the stream. The second approach, adapting to floods, also has two components. A, reducing the exposure to the floods, for example by relocating a community that is vulnerable to a flood. B, improving the capacity of a community to cope with the floods, for example by improving the flood proofing of the houses in a community, or by improving flood preparedness of that community. Now, let's look into in a bit more detail about the approach of reducing the flood flow which comes into a floodplain. Amount of water flowing through a stream or overland into the concerned floodplain in a given time is called the flood flow. During a storm in the watershed, the flow starts with a minimum level and attains peak value, known as the peak flow, with time. The time taken to attain this peak is known as the lag time. Highest flooding usually occurs during the peak flow. Therefore, the flood managers try to reduce this peak flow and reduce the damage. They also try to increase the lag time, which will give more preparing time to the affected communities. This diagram and the graph explains how the peak flow is reduced and the lag time is increased by flood risk management methods. Examples for methods that can reduce flood flow are flood control dams, diversions, wetland restoration, upper watershed restoration, and swales.
Once the floodwaters enter a floodplain, there are numerous methods to manage the flood flow within it. These include improving conveyance in the streams, removing the barriers to flow in the landscape, and improving stormwater drainage and improving the stability of the stream banks to withstand the peak flows. Examples of this type of methods are floodways, engineered drainage systems, and restoration of natural drainage paths. Now let's look at the approach of adapting to the floods. Adaptation can be done either by reducing the exposure or the vulnerability of the communities to floods, for example by relocating the communities, or flood-proofing the houses, as you can see in the top figure, or by improving the capacity of the communities to cope with the floods. For example, by improving flood preparedness, the early warning systems, methods of evacuation, as you can see in the bottom picture. It should also be kept in mind that different flood risk management methods are effective in managing different types of floods. The page 120 of the Flood Green Guide gives which soft and hard structural methods are most suitable for each flood type. It should also be noted that the effectiveness of different flood risk management methods may differ according to the scale they are applied. Whether it's the entire watershed scale, whether it's the particular floodplain scale, whether it's a community scale or a household scale. For example, a flood control dam or upper watershed restoration may reduce flood flows at the entire watershed scale. Methods such as constructed wetlands and pumping may be effective in managing the flood risks within a particular floodplain, while methods such as flood and waterproofing is effective at individual household levels. The flood managers should also remember that there are multiple social, economic, and environmental benefits of each flood risk management method. They should always try to maximize these multiple benefits by selecting the proper combination of methods. The table 5.3 of the Flood Green Guide helps the flood managers to understand these benefits. As it was mentioned in the principles lecture, the effectiveness of a flood risk management project can be optimized by combining flood risk management methods. By combining, the benefits of the methods can be maximized and both economic and environmental costs can be reduced. As an example, I'll take the same case discussed in the principles lecture. Think about a flood control project designed only to include one large dam. If the design is changed to include an upper watershed restoration upstream of the dam and a wetland restoration downstream of the dam, the upper watershed restoration will reduce the flood flow coming into the dam, and the wetland will increase the flood retention capacity in the floodplain. With this, the size of the dam can be substantially reduced, which will reduce the cost of the project and also the environmental impacts of building a large dam. There are also other factors that you have to consider in choosing flood risk management methods for projects, such as design requirements and safety, operational requirements, maintenance requirements, and cost. By considering all these factors, flood managers can select an optimal combination of methods which can maximize the reduction of the risks, maximize the multiple benefits of the selected flood risk management methods, and minimize the environmental, social, and economic costs of the overall project. Thank you.
yeah, hope the video worked well. Sometimes we get problems with that video because there are these like chalkboard animations and things like that. Sometimes they don't play well. In my end it worked well. Was it okay? Did it
Yes,
run
it was,
smoothly?
sir.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so now I think you have some idea about what are the principles like involved in selecting flood risk management methods or methods for a flood risk management projects, how to combine them, what is the logic behind combining them. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of tools, frameworks available in the Flood Green Guide to support people to do them. You don't need any expert knowledge to use them. So please, I encourage you to get a copy of course, a digital copy of yours and have a look through these. So just to go a bit detail into some of the methods that can be of use to architects in your day-to-day work, I'll quickly go through a couple of them. Just give me a second. Right. So since we have gone through the basics or the principles of designing or selecting flood risk management methods for a project, shall we quickly go through this question? What is the best combination of methods to achieve the objective? Like, so I created an objective for you. Like if you think of an objective like eliminate the loss of life due to annual flash in the hypocity by 2030. Now, this is like a typical example of a proper flood risk management objective. It clearly says what is the risk that we are going to deal with. That is, loss of life is the risk that we are dealing with. That's what we want to make an impact on. The impact or the change that we want to bring is to eliminate the loss of life, like not to reduce it, not to bring it by this percentage, but to eliminate. But to do that, there should be a time frame, so that is by 2030, right? So this is an example of a good flood risk management objective. Now, let's look at what are the potential combinations of flood risk management methods that can achieve this objective. Right, please go through. So number one, it says upper watershed flood control dam, flood wall along the city, flood pumping station for the city. The second option is revegetation of upper watersheds, riparian ecosystem vegetation, restoration, and swales and infiltration systems within the city. The third one says flood warning and evacuation framework, flood preparedness training, retention ponds within the city, and flood pumping station for the highest risk areas. So let's also, again, like, please do put your views in the chat box. So I already have some answers. Ria says it's a combination of 2 and 3. Peñalosa says it's 2, 1, and 3, like in terms of priority, I think. Yeah, there's another answer. All of them. Number 3. As of now, we have like nearly 50-50 split between option number 2 and option number 3. I get another answer. Palad says number 2 is addressing the root cause, and number 1 and 3 are more reactive solutions to the current issue. That's good. 3 and 1. Okay, shall we close the polling? So as you can see, it's a 50-50 split between the second option and the third option. So if I can explain a bit, the first option was actually all entirely hard engineering, right? Upper watershed control dams, flood walls, and so on. So they might be able to stop the floodwaters coming into the sea and eliminate, coming into the city. And if there's no floodwaters coming in, of course, then there's no floods due to no deaths due to the flood, right? But the thing is, we have to think about other problems that these methods would bring in. Upper watershed dams. Dams are very damaging to the environment. Flood walls restrict the lateral connectivity between the river and the floodplain. Flood pumping stations are very costly in operating. The second one was all nature-based methods or soft methods: upper watershed revegetation, riparian ecosystem restoration, swales and infiltration systems. They are all good, as one has pointed out. They address the root cause of the flood. But then again, you can't totally eliminate floods using nature-based or soft methods alone, right? Or with soft methods, because in soft methods, we always accept the fact that some level of flooding should happen, right? So because of that, if the flood is coming to the city, there might be a danger of loss of life. But if you take the third one, flood warning and evacuation framework, which is very important. So people die in floods because they are not properly warned. Like no one goes, and unless they are suicidal, no one goes into the floods knowingly, right? So if there is a proper flood warning and evacuation framework, even if their houses gets flooded in a intense, high intensity sudden flood, if they are warned well enough, they can be evacuated and lives could be saved. And flood preparedness training saves lives as well. What to do in a flood, where to go, where not to go, keep the people trained. Then to reduce the potential of flash flooding, we can develop retention ponds within the city to reduce the velocity of the floods, and then flood pumping stations in the highest risk areas. So 3 is a combination of non-structural, soft structural, and hard structural methods. It looks at the issue as a whole, right? So third would be my choice, but of course one can say it could be a combination of second and the third, or even all 3, but depending on what are the principles that you are using. Okay, so with this, let's quickly look at some methods for urban landscape and house nature-based methods for flood risk management for urban landscape and household scales. One very common method, a method that is getting very popular, soft method or nature-based methods, are retention basins and detention basins and retention ponds. Right? A retention pond is actually a water body which holds the water for maybe a few hours or a couple of days, which actually reduces the both the velocity of water and then lag time, right? It increases the lag time so that it gives more time for people to prepare. Detention basins, basically, they do not necessarily store water in a big way, but they reduce the velocity of water and reducing the flash floods. So these are getting more and more popular. They had been in use in Western countries for a long time. In the United States, some people call them GIs or green infrastructure, and in Australia they call them water sensitive urban design, right? And in the UK they call them methods like this sustainable urban drainage systems or SUDS, right? So any of these systems, right? So transiting. Yeah. Like when you select a method for a flood risk management project, there are some typical questions that you can ask. How does this work? Like as I described about retention ponds and detention basins, it works by holding the water temporarily and reducing the velocity of water, which is very beneficial in reducing the flash floods. What are the co-benefits? Like if you look at the co-benefits of retention ponds and detention basins, they not only provide flood reduction, but it provides environmental benefits, like retention ponds can support biodiversity, and also recreational benefits. People can come and picnic around it and so on. And it might also be rainwater collection systems for large areas, right? What are the socio-economic pros and cons? With regard to these systems, the social and economic pros would be they can provide social benefits, right? Recreational benefits. Economic costs would be they can be much cheaper than building some large hard engineering structures, right? And there are cons or the disadvantages of them as well. What are the potential maintenance and operational consideration? How frequently would you have to weed or clean a retention pond? How do you maintain the gates, right? Do you need a person to a permanent person to maintain and operate the system? Right? These are the questions that you should ask about any method. Another method which comes in handy for at the neighborhood scales, and especially would be helpful, like can be used by, would be relevant to urban planners, are swales and permeable pavements and large scale, like community level rainwater harvesting systems and rain gardens. All these systems actually help the water to infiltrate better, right? And reducing the runoff. Flooding is created by runoff, the water which runs on the land, not by the water that goes into the land. So all these systems, whether it's swales, which improves infiltration, permeable pavement systems, right, which allows, although there is a pavement, it allows the water to infiltrate through it. Whether it's rainwater harvesting, which temporarily can, it's like a large collection of small retention basins, right? It temporarily collects the water during a storm, right? And then it can slowly release if there's a surplus of water, right? All these systems allows you to retain the water for a short time and reduce the velocity of the water. They are very cost effective, right? And there are many other social benefits of them, like you can use that water, rainwater harvesting, for your household needs or gardening and so on. Swales can be urban green space. They can be used for recreational needs and so on. Green roofs and green walls, which are also getting very, very popular in the developed world. In the West, it had been in practice for some time now, but it's getting popular in developing countries as well. Especially in India, there's a big culture of roof gardening now coming up in places like New Delhi or Chandigarh. It has many benefits, right? Like extended roof life, because it protects the roof from extreme heat and so on, right? Heating and cooling energy needs can be cut down to about cut by about 40%. This is creating urban green space. You are not by constructing a building, you are not eliminating your garden space, you are just shifting it upwards, right? And then there are noise reduction benefits and so on. But also you should keep one thing in mind, this might be very relevant to the architects. The buildings, a roof garden is an additional load on the building, and it can also impose other loads like wind loads. It can capture more wind, right? If there are larger trees, like in the first in the photo, right? In the first photo, it can capture more winds. So the building, you have to first check whether the building is good enough. Has it been designed well enough to accommodate these new loads, right? And then there are methods for flood proofing of buildings, right? Which can be applied at household levels. First step of flood proofing is making sure that your buildings are structurally sound to handle flood loads, right? The buoyant loads and the lateral loads and things like that. So it's more or less a job for a structural engineer. Second, there is a method called dry flood proofing, where you can protect your buildings. The water may come into your land, but you can protect the buildings from getting it into to your building, to your house, right? Basically, these methods are used in non-residential buildings. Not really. It's not recommended to build houses in areas, residential buildings in areas where it can flood, and then try to reduce the water that is coming into your house. But for non-residential buildings, definitely these things can be used. So dry flood proofing is preventing water coming into your building. And there's another methods like this, what you can see, like a floodgate or a flood barrier erected in front of the door, so to a certain height, which prevents the water. Even if the water is high, it won't seep into your building. And then there's this method called wet flood proofing, where you let part of the water come into your building, and not into the living spaces, other spaces, which provides the space for the water to flow, but will not have an adverse impact on the people using the structures. So this is called flood proofing. There are many good resources, especially developed by FEMA in the US, on like technical guides on how to apply these methods to your buildings. Please, if you find any difficulty in finding them, just have any difficulty in finding these resources, just let us know. We can direct you to those systems. And then finally, the non-structural methods such as zonal planning, urban flood preparedness programs, training the people to cope with the floods, proper flood warning and evacuation framework, such as loudspeakers set in areas to give warnings about floods, mobile messaging systems, and so on. And then, of course, as I discussed earlier, building codes of flood proofing. Okay, that is my presentation on the methods. So we can take any questions. Quick questions about these two lectures if you want now. Any particular questions about the methods, principles of method selection that I discussed, or even from the last lecture? If not, we can actually move on to Pamela's lecture directly and then take the Q&A altogether.
We could probably move on with
Yes.
Pam's presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. So it's nice to be here back again at UAP Makati. I gave a talk last year on participation in your Design for Humanity series, and it's so good to be back. I actually have come full circle when it comes to this Flood Green Guide training. I first encountered it as Misaka's attendee, as Misaka's trainee back in Thailand in 2019. Back then, of course, it was pre-COVID, and the training that I attended was a week-long training. So what Misaka and I are doing now is a very condensed version. We're taking something that typically takes 5 days to train, and we're condensing it to 2 hours, 2.5 hours. But since we've given you access to the book, so any additional questions that you have, if you want more detail on any of the topics that Misaka and I have discussed today, then you can consult the book. And by all means, if you have any additional questions after this presentation, like what we usually do in our Flood Green Guide trainings, we ask organizers to compile a list of questions. You can send it to us and we'll answer it in the Google Doc and send it back to you. Because it's a lot of information. It also takes a while to absorb as well. So I'll be doing what it's one of the I wouldn't want to call it final stages of the Flood Green Guide training, but in the sequence of training that we do, it's the last topic that we discuss, but by all means, it's not something that you do at the end of the training. So it's monitoring and evaluation. Okay, so I'll start with some initial assumptions, many of which Misaka has already covered in the 2 previous talks. So as it was emphasized today, flooding is a natural and valuable process. Certainly, people across time and civilizations have congregated, have converged along bodies of water for their economic benefits, for their agricultural benefits, but also for social and well-being benefits as well. But in the Philippine context in particular, flood can pose a lot of risks. We're an archipelago. 80% of our provinces have coastal areas. Like many other developing countries, 60% of our population live in coastal areas. So for developing countries, the figure is usually 50%. Onwards, ours is 60%. We're vulnerable to climate change. Sea level rise in the Philippines is higher compared to the global average. So in Manila Bay alone, which covers several administrative regions, not just Metro Manila, sea level rise is at 3 millimeters per year. That is 4 times the global average. So we're at risk because we're a developing country. We're at risk because we're exposed to climate change. And also we're at risk because, again, it's also a developing country problem. There is a lot of unplanned urbanization. There's population growth as well. So all of these factors combined, plus governance issues, of course, these all contribute to flood shifting from being a hazard to flood becoming a disaster. And because the stakes are high, those who implement flood risk management projects have a heavy responsibility, and we need to be accountable as people doing work in this space. Now, the presentation is really going to go through principles of assessment that apply to flood risk management. But there are many commonalities doing monitoring and evaluation across different fields. So most of the things that I'll be talking about today will be translatable to other fields as well. So when we talk about monitoring and evaluation, we are essentially talking about 2 sides of the same coin. They're both types of assessment, but we do them in different modes. So monitoring is usually done in shorter intervals while the project is ongoing. And in some fields, monitoring is called formative assessment because it's done while the project is being created or while the project is being formed. And the purpose of monitoring is really to make improvements during project implementation. Now, for evaluation, it usually takes longer intervals. When we talk about evaluation, in the Flood Green Guide training, we usually talk about 5 years, give or take, whereas monitoring could be done on the daily, weekly, maybe even every 2 years. But of course, it really depends on the scale of the project. And so for evaluation, it's really all about finding patterns in the data. Evaluation builds on monitoring, and you do this so you can make value judgments about the project. So in other fields, evaluation is called summative assessment because you're basically about the sum of all the efforts of the project. So, we implemented this, and so what? What's next? So evaluation becomes the basis for the subsequent stages of a project. Whether do you want to do it again, whether you want to do it with more or less budget, or with different priorities altogether, or if you want to stop doing it altogether. That's the kind of decisions that you make after evaluation. Now, some guiding principles for evaluation. So you base your M&E measures on project objectives and the methods applied. So again, going back to Masaka's presentation, it really depends on whether you want to reduce the flood, control its flow, or empower those affected to navigate the flood and reduce the risks. And then you also need to identify the M&E scope, methods, and responsibilities at the beginning of the project. I've done M&E across different fields. The problem is the same. The idea of measurement and evaluation usually comes up when, at the end of the project, when people feel that the project is not performing as well as expected, and they're scrambling to find solutions. So do your M&E at the beginning of the project and be clear about what the parameters are, who's responsible for what. You also want to do M&E at the beginning of the project because you want to establish baseline data. Because so at the end of the day, if for example I implement a revegetation program so that I can help farmers protect their livelihood, and I come up with some data where the crop yield was so and so number of tons. How do I know if that's better or worse compared to when the project started if I don't have any baseline data? So you have to do it at the beginning of the project. The third is to adopt a holistic approach. So the approach that we're talking about here is integrated flood risk management. So we don't just focus on the environment, we don't just focus on people. These two things have to work together. So we look at environmental impact, we look at the impact on say conservation and biodiversity, and simultaneously we also look at the social economic impact on livelihoods, on social networks, etc. And the fourth is to allocate proper financial resources. This goes hand in hand with principles 1 and 2. If you don't do it earlier in the program, if you don't define your project objectives early on, then you probably won't have the right financial resources, technologies, staffing, and skills to conduct a proper monitoring and evaluation. Okay, and then the fifth, very important, define terms and parameters clearly. So for example, let's start with the flood risk objective, like protect livelihoods in the lower watershed. So what livelihoods are we talking about? Are we talking about farmers? Are we talking about, is flood risk management about protecting crops, and what in specifically which crops? Are we talking about an urban area where the livelihoods mostly come from the informal sector, and what we actually have to protect are social networks? So these are very important things to define. One case I shared recently, also as part of a recent talk that I gave at WWF, is an evacuation center where the evacuation center was supposed to double as a community center, and it was supposed to double as a place where people could hold different community activities. But it wasn't defined what community activities could be held in the evacuation center. So, for example, holding a cotillion for one of the government LGU's daughters. Is that a community activity or not? And then so there was a lot of social tension around the use of the evacuation center in the long run. And then sixth, very important in any type of research is to assure accuracy, reliability, and comparability of data. So accuracy has to do with the data being error-free. Usually the errors in accuracy happen at the point of data entry. So whether you're encoding answers from questionnaires or recording interviews or inputting data from quantitative sources, it's usually in this transfer of data from one form to another where the inaccuracy happens. Reliability has to do with the consistency of your data. So for example, if you're not, all types of sensors, temperature sensors, water sensors have to be maintained, have to be calibrated regularly. And if you can't do that, then the reliability of your data across, for example, Amihan and Habagat, southwest monsoon versus northeast monsoon might not be reliable. And of course, accuracy and reliability is the basis for comparability. You want your data to be comparable, especially if you're doing a large-scale flood risk management program that maybe covers the entire watershed or even an entire neighborhood. You want to make sure that the data from different points in your flood risk management space can be compared. And then seventh is to have a balanced monitoring plan. So what I mean by balance is balancing point number 6, accuracy, reliability, and comparability with your financial resources. Because in the ideal world, you would hire a lot of experts, you would give a lot of resources for the community to do monitoring, but budgets are limited. So you always have to strike a balance between the amount of expertise and the quality of data that you have. Of course, the data has to be quality, but the scope and the parameters of the monitoring need to be taken into consideration with the budget that you have. And lastly, eighth is involve a combination of official, expert, and community assessors. So when we're talking about official assessors, these would be people who are part of the implementing organization. They could be LGU or an NGO that the LGU is working with to implement a flood risk management program. Your experts could be, people like Misaka, who really have that breadth and depth of knowledge about flood risk management, or maybe people based in the academe. And then lastly, community assessors. So let's take a poll at this point and answer the question, to what extent is community engagement needed in monitoring and evaluation for flood risk management? Is it a nice to have? Does it depend on the project, or is it essential? And you can also send through your thoughts on the pros and cons of flood risk management through community participation. Okay, I think it's pretty much a majority answer. It is essential, community participation. We can end the poll now. It's quite straightforward, and it's a point that Misaka also made earlier. Community participation is essential to flood risk management. But I'd have to say that the top-down approach to flood risk management, measurement, and evaluation is still the conventional approach. There is a growing body of evidence, though, that flood risk management projects that have integrated community monitoring into their M&E are more effective in the long term. People kind of because people feel involved, they kind of accept the project more because there's more opportunity for them to integrate whatever flood management solution was agreed upon into their way of life. Okay. So let me just reflash the slide again that was shared earlier. There are many advantages to community engagement across the flood risk management process, but specifically for M&E. So community engagement is a way to gather data that complements quantitative data. It's also a way to share knowledge and findings. So one argument for community engagement is really more effective project delivery through the sharing of data. And I've certainly seen it in certain projects that I've been fortunate to be part of. I've seen there were cases where I've seen geohazard maps gathered through quantitative information, of course, shared to the community. And then because the community has direct experience of flooding in a particular area, they were able to pinpoint specific hazards that were not covered by the maps. For example, in Cebu, community participation project that I attended showed that the maps, include that wasn't part of the map, and that was also integrated into the plans and also integrated into the flood risk monitoring and evaluation. Another example was in Palop, when we were doing after Typhoon Haiyan, no, we also went there to do some humanitarian work. And when we talk to people, they would usually say that the reason why we were caught unprepared, aside from the fact that we didn't know what the definition of storm surge was because we're used to storms. So it's typhoons are part of our everyday life, and we already have a set of practices that we do to make sure that we manage the risk of typhoons. So we asked them, at what point did you know that Yolanda or Haiyan was a different kind of typhoon? What happened? How did you know that, maybe it's time to evacuate if they didn't evacuate? Or how did you know that this is going to be much bigger than you expected? And people said it was when vehicles in the streets, parked vehicles in the streets started to float. So you can imagine that this kind of very real lived experience of flood can be integrated, for example, in a checklist for early warning and evacuation. Okay. And then also, there's also, aside from the argument for effectiveness, there's also the argument for, people having a voice in flood risk management programs and people being able to participate in flood risk management programs so that these programs can also contribute to poverty reduction and to social justice. Floods don't come out of nowhere. They are based on governance and social justice issues. And so a flood risk management program also has to address these issues as well. It's a way to empower communities. It's also a way to build relationships across different stakeholders in a community so that they have a stronger voice when it comes to flood risk management. Okay, so there's some M&E considerations that are specific to flood risk management. So when doing your indicators for flood risk management monitoring, you want to think about environmental considerations, hydrological, climatic, geophysical, topographical, and ecological concerns. You want to look at the type of vegetation that you had at the beginning as your baseline data, perhaps the soil quality as well, if you're doing a reforestation or revegetation program, and even note the types of species that are endemic to the place. Of course, financial resources. It's a given. No? You need to understand your budget allocations, the timeliness of tranches. You need to plan that out as well. You might have a schedule for monitoring for a specific month, but if the budget isn't there, then you miss out on an opportunity to establish data and gather timely data. There are also sociocultural aspects such as acceptability and representation. For flooded areas, like areas affected by storm surges, areas affected by, say, Andoy or Yolanda, the typical prescription for flood risk management is relocation. But a lot of communities tend to resist this type of flood risk management strategy because of concerns about maintaining their way of life, maintaining their livelihood, being close to their social networks, the people who help them overcome poverty from a day-to-day basis. So it's important not to just look at it from a geophysical, geohazard standpoint. You also have to look at it from a livelihood standpoint and socioeconomic standpoint as well, because that is how we do it in integrated flood risk management. We try to be holistic, and certainly social cultural aspects are one of the dimensions of flood risk management and disaster risk reduction in general that get overlooked, but are very fundamental to the project. Human capabilities, you want to make sure that the expertise, skills, and training are in place, especially if you're introducing community based monitoring to a community. Community-based monitoring, as far as the national government of the Philippines is concerned, has been around since the 1990s. But in April of 2019, we finally approved a Community-Based Monitoring Systems Act, which basically allocates technology-based, allocates resources for the technology-based collection, processing, and validation of data. So, I mean, there is a legal framework in place to support community-based monitoring in the country. Fifth is, need to make sure that the technologies are available. If you want to measure rainfall, Doppler radars, for example, are quite important. If you remember, around Typhoon Ondoy, that not having enough Doppler radars in the country was a big issue, and because of that, we weren't able to project that so much rain was going to come and it was going to cause so much flooding and death in Metro Manila and the surrounding areas. And now we do. If you remember, in the past, when a typhoon was coming, we only have the typhoon signals as information to act upon. And after Ondoy, we now have rainfall data as well, projected rainfall data as well, to inform our decisions for flood adaptation. We also need to understand, number 6, the project scale, whether you want to do it at the level of the watershed or the neighborhood, and the administrative regions that are included in your scale. So it could be something as simple as a purok, or a village, or where you're dealing with a homeowner association. At the watershed scale, it can involve multiple provinces or even multiple countries. Number 7 is seasonality. And this is also why it's important to involve the community, because with climate change, our notion of summer and rainy months is changing. I remember doing ethnographic research with fisherfolk communities around 10 years ago, and you ask them, when is summer, when is tag-ulan or rainy season? The answers were kind of definite. Summer starts March to May, rainy season is June to November, and then there's a cold, dry season in between. But now that I'm working with a fishing community and I ask people when is summer, they have a harder time answering that question because of climate change. They say they can't. Sometimes it's hard to tell anymore. And so these kind of shifts in how we define seasons and how we define weather, you need the lived experience of the community to help you define those parameters, because more often than not, The people who are implementing flood risk management programs don't necessarily live in the communities. We tend to be outsiders. And if we do tend to stay in communities, it's not for the long term. So we don't have to bear the full impact of our own plans and our own the programs that we conceptualize. Okay, so monitoring for flood risk management. Oops. Okay, first of all, one advantage is, again, gauge the effects of measures. You want to know what's not working, why it's not working, why things are working. It's an opportunity to assess the effects of initiatives and mitigation measures. It's also a way for you to do adaptive management. Things always go wrong. So it's better through monitoring to identify issues early enough before they become challenges, problems, or worse, catastrophes. And then lastly, as mentioned earlier, you want to do M&E for stakeholder engagement. It's a way to keep the project stakeholders informed and involved. Monitoring and evaluation are, by default, they're critical endeavors because you're trying to find out, what's working, what's not working. And it might put certain people, especially those who are implementing the project, on a defensive. So it's better to involve people earlier on and collaborate with them on your monitoring parameters early on in the project. So they already know that certain things will be monitored and it's not something that they will take personally. Okay, so in the next couple of slides, we'll just go through some examples of M&E requirements and dimensions for flood risk management. So on the left are the types of things to be monitored, followed by the responsibility and the frequency. I've given some examples that are closer to the field of architecture, and just deprioritize those that require, large-scale infrastructure. So in terms of stability of physical features and structures, one of the things very basic that you want to monitor is whether structures are in place in their intended location. And this is something that the community and the officials can look into. I mean, these are not strict rules on who to involve, but they're just guidelines and they can definitely change depending on the nature of the project. And then the frequency here can be regular. And then second is you might also want to check, visible damages to structures and malfunctions such as cracks or malfunctioning equipment like auto sirens. And for here, you can involve the community, officials, and experts, and frequency can be regular to immediate. You can also check the structural strength and integrity of tests. Of course, this is already very technical knowledge. So this is something that the experts should be involved in, and the frequency is for long term. Now, costs and maintenance of the physical features is also one thing to consider. And we're looking at both structural and ecological features. This isn't necessarily relevant to non-structural methods like policy making or urban planning. So one aspect here is adequate personnel to operate and maintain features. This can be looked over by officials and experts, and immediate to long-term frequency. Make sure that the physical features are maintained and there are no maintenance issues or bottlenecks. Again, this is the domain of officials or experts and can be done in intermediate intervals. And that the current and operational costs are in line, or if they are not, then what's the reason? So I guess any project that you do will need a measurement, a monitoring and evaluation component that looks into costs and maintenance. And the column on the left just illustrates what specific cost issues would you want to look at for flood risk management. Okay, another aspect is program management. So one thing that you could look at here is, do you have enough personnel to carry out social mobilization and awareness activities? This is particularly important because early warning activities do involve the community. They're quite dependent on social networks and on social media. So you just want to make sure that these elements are included in the monitoring plan. Normally, when we involve communities here in the Philippines, we don't. It's kind of it's quite analog in the community-based monitoring systems for disaster. Usually, monitoring for disaster, for early warning takes place monthly. The community or whoever's implementing the project just gathers, stakeholders from the community. They usually go through a checklist of things to make sure that everything is in place, and then it's followed by a focus group discussion afterwards. And this can be done monthly or quarterly. But in other countries, the participation in monitoring for it can be evacuation and early warning, as well as more long-term urban planning, is sometimes done through digital platforms. I've seen a case in Finland where, for example, a digital platform, a web platform was used for scenario planning, for urban planning decisions and disaster scenarios. And then included in there was getting the citizens to lay down their decisions depending on the scenario, and that helped with the modeling for the city. Now, you can also measure whether you have adequate staff knowledge or training in place. Again, especially if you're going to do community-based monitoring, the training needs to be there first before you roll out the program. And you need to involve people who are already sort of predisposed to this kind of activities. Let's not assume also that communities aren't doing their own monitoring. People have their own ways of gauging the environment, of assessing risk. So these kind of on-ground ways and ways based on everyday experience need to be integrated in your monitoring plan. And then lastly, just look at the costs. If the administrative costs are in line, and if not, then provide reasons for doing it. Okay, so second to the last is ecological sustainability. So some of the dimensions here could include unanticipated issues with structural or ecological interventions where you might want to involve community officials and experts. Evidence of species loss, eutrophication, or pollution can also include communities and experts. Experts, of course, would have the macro view of these kinds of shifts in the ecology, whereas communities' knowledge in this end will come into very specific places. And certainly, if your community is farmers or fisher folk or the urban poor who are living along the riverbanks, then they themselves, just for their everyday activities, will be able to see whether your flood risk management program is exacerbating or improving, biodiversity or addressing pollution issues. And then lastly, are there any anticipated environmental threats to the ecological features of the program? You can have a combination of stakeholders for this, including officials, communities, and experts. Okay, and last is social acceptability. So again, this is such an under researched and overlooked part of flood risk management. Can somebody put their mic on mute? Thank you. Okay. For social acceptability, okay, this is super important. You want to make sure that the community embraces the project. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
Yes, we
okay.
can now. I think we had some technical difficulties earlier.
Okay, I'll just share my screen again. Okay, so this is really important, and it's, you know, the approach to disaster risk reduction and flood risk management, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's really top down. So even if communities are the people who are most impacted by the decisions of flood risk managers, their views are really not always included in flood risk management programs. So again, let's go back to housing, because that's closest to architecture. A lot of the housing projects, not just in the Philippines, but around the world, for relocation as a strategy for flood risk management, are rejected by communities. So now and then we hear reports of housing programs where the communities have abandoned the houses, maybe they've even sold the houses to other people, or they just don't use them. So these are signs that a community perspective has not been integrated into the program. And from an M&E perspective, these are also signs that you want to monitor, no? To what extent do people accept the houses that they've been given? To what extent are they actually living in them? And when there are problems in this regard, at least from an integrated flood risk management perspective, we try not to look at these as people being undisciplined or ungrateful or matigas ang ulo. These are usually symptoms of a lack of inclusion in flood risk management programs. Now, second is threats to physical features. Again, you know, when things like vandalism happen, that's not something external to flood risk management. That usually has to do with the acceptability of the program, and it points to larger issues of social justice. And for the two, the responsibility can fall on the community and the officials. Now, let's have a little pop quiz again here. So what about threats to ecological features? Like, for example, if you have a revegetation program, like you're trying to grow grassland in the upper watershed so you can reduce the runoff in the lower watershed, and you suddenly see that, you know, there are animals grazing in the last in the grassland. Or if it's a reforestation project and suddenly you want to monitor whether people are using the timber in your project for, I don't know, for housing or maybe for business purposes. Who should monitor this? Can we show the poll question? Is it community and experts, community and officials, officials and experts, or everyone? Okay, we're getting in more votes. If you haven't answered the poll yet, please answer. And we'll just entertain questions or comments at the end, so we can manage the time better. Okay. Okay, so we have officials, community, and experts. I think we can end the poll now. Let's show the results. Okay, so we have officials, community, and experts as with the most number of votes, followed by community and officials, and more or less the same for community and experts and officials and experts. Okay, let's see. Okay, so it's community and officials. And the reason we're saying this is because it goes back to that earlier principle where you kind of need to balance your monitoring. It's expensive to hire experts. And these things, no, if are animals grazing, are people felling the timber in your revegetation or reforestation efforts, this is something that you can just eyeball. This is something that you can just observe in everyday, your everyday comings and goings within the community. Experts come in, two things where you want to use experts. First is if you need like in-depth, really technical knowledge to assess. So for example, testing the structural integrity of a dam that's built or a levee that's been built. You need a structural engineer for that. You also want independent experts when you want a sense of neutrality it's important to have a sense of neutrality in your evaluation. So let's look at, okay, where's that? Let's go back to, yeah, here, for example, current maintenance and operational costs are in line. Because this involves budgets. You kind of want someone who has a more neutral position, not someone who's directly involved in the organization or the local government running the project. It's important to have some independence in this aspect. Okay. So we've covered monitoring, and just a quick note on evaluation, because evaluation builds on monitoring. So for evaluation, you want it to be both specific and general. Use your monitoring data to spot patterns, to make larger value judgments about your methods and the project as a whole. And also use evaluation to highlight strengths, issues, opportunities, or threats, your typical SWOT. We've all done this at one point in our careers. And then use it for planning, to provide input for the next stages of the program, or whether or not you want a different set of objectives entirely, or if you want to scale down or scale up the program. And then do it at fixed time periods. Again, in the Flood Green Guide, we recommend every 5 years, or when there's a change in external factors. So examples of external factors could be shifts in population. You could have a flood risk management project that involves relocation by a certain time, but if a typhoon or a big disaster suddenly happens, that might fast track your migration. So you need to be aware of these kinds of movements. Third is a shift in planning regimes. So planning in the Philippines is, of course, based on land use plans. And there could be some shifts in this end. Like, for example, Palawan recently explored splitting the province into 3. So if you have a flood risk management that covers the entire province, and then suddenly you have 3 provinces instead of 1, then you need to adjust your plans accordingly. And then third, of course, are climatic shifts, change or increase in number of hazards or risk exposure, especially with, for example, in the site that I'm working in, it's sea level rise plus land subsidence. It's been manageable maybe 20 years ago, but now it's a very intense situation, and the risks are increasing every day. I'm working with a fisherfolk community. In the past, their fishing nets, their fish corrals would be damaged maybe once or twice a year. Now it's happening practically every month. So we really do need to know when we need to change our parameters and not just monitor them blindly. Okay, lastly, final words. Again, plan your M&E early. It's not an afterthought. It's something that goes with objectives planning, and it's important because you want to establish your baseline data, very important for you to understand whether your program is working or not. Second, there is no one way to monitor. So while we're advocating for community participation in M&E, and while we're saying that community participation is integral to M&E, we are not saying that it replaces the need to consult with experts. Flood risk management has a lot of technical aspects, and you also need a sense of neutrality and objectiveness in doing your monitoring. So bring in your experts when you want to address these two things. And lastly, the whole point of everything is that flood risk management must be evidence-based. We should be doing our flood risk management plans not because there's a cool new technology to implement, or not because simply because there's a grant available and we need to use it. There has to be data, whether qualitative or quantitative. They're both important types of data, but flood risk management must be grounded in data. So thank you very much for listening. It's been 3 presentations. I really appreciate your patience, and Ms. Akay and I can now take questions if you have any.
All right. Thank you, Architect Pamela Kahilig and Dr. Misaka Hetiyarachi for that very insightful talk. And I believe...
Sorry, I'm not an architect, I'm an anthropologist.
Sorry, Miss Pamela. Correction for that. Thank you. Ms. Pamela Kahilig and Dr. Misaka Hetiyarachi for that very insightful talk. And I believe that the natural and nature-based flood management, the Green Guide, will be so essential to us professionals. And I like the part that you discussed about the flood management and how it should be done, its methods, and the need of community engagement. And I hope that our government, both national and local government units, should adapt and be knowledgeable as well of this guide, especially because this has been one of the biggest problems in our country. All right, so thanks again for that wonderful talk, Ms. Pamela and Dr. Misaka. Again, we'd like to thank all the Zoom etiquettes, and thank you for actively participating on our polls. All right, so we would also like to remind you that later on after this webinar, we will be sending you the assessment tests on your registered emails. And for those who attended on our webinar last March, we will be also sending your certificates together with their today's webinar certificate. And I guess we could have a 2-minute break, a bathroom break, or a little stretch on your seats before we proceed to our Q&A portion. Also, our Zoom chat is open now for questions, so we could bring them up later. All right?
Hi everyone! Welcome to Design Armoire. We made Calcolites available here in the Philippines through Design Armoire. We want Filipinos to have an access to world-class, elegant lights that are known all over the world. It's Pinoy pride at its best, and we're very proud to showcase these pieces at Design Armoire. Whether you want to redo your home or just spruce up some spaces, Design Armoire is here for your handcrafted needs and luxurious pieces that are within reach. Come by the store and let your design inspiration come to life. Design Armoire, luxury you can afford.
Mm. All right. So I guess kindly for our participants, kindly put your questions now on our Zoom chat. And I guess we are all ready to move forward to our Q&A portion. Okay, so kindly have your questions placed in our Zoom chats. And for those who are watching through our Facebook Live, you could also drop down your questions on the comment box below. All right, so and without further ado, here to moderate our Q&A, Architect Raya Zamudio, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Lelaine. And good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you've all enjoyed that very comprehensive talk. And of course, a very good afternoon to our esteemed speakers from the World Wildlife Fund, Dr. Misaka and Ms. Pamela. So thank you very much for sharing with us your knowledge and expertise in disaster risk management and in such a condensed period too. So I guess while we're waiting for questions to come in, personally, my main takeaway from your talk is that we do not necessarily have to rely solely on structural means in order to manage disaster risks. And a better way that you introduced is to first consider the natural or nature-based methods in developing a more integrated approach. So that's a very wonderful concept. We've highlighted the benefits of having that integrated approach to risk management. So I suppose my first question is, and this is for both of the speakers, in general, what do you think is the most challenging aspect of implementing this kind of approach? Perhaps we could start off with Dr. Misaka.
Okay, I was muted. Sorry. You can hear me now, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yes. It's a very, very challenging question to begin with. Like, what's the biggest challenge? Because there are many, so many challenges in incorporating or bringing these concepts of nature-based flood risk management into a field like flood management, which has been there for nearly 200 years in its modern form, right? It starts with probably the classical flood risk management, which is initially called flood management engineering or flood control engineering, right? By the structures that they built to control floods in Western Europe, mainly in the UK. Like there were like a layer upon layer of flood risk, flood management or flood control structures in the River Thames in London, and then there were massive flood management, flood control infrastructure built in the Netherlands, right? There are famous flood runs and dikes and so on. And even if you go to places like France, you find extensive flood control engineering schemes. So these are all very hard engineering focused methods. And if you just look at like the three countries that I mentioned, it's England, Netherlands, and France, which were actually the initial places where this modern technology, the capitalist economic systems emerged. And so it is as old as modernity and capitalist economic systems. So I think to name a single challenge, if we can, is more than anything like in a discussion like this. Generally, the challenges that would be raised by the audience would be like, one is lack of funding, right? And the other is lack of political will, which of course are very critical challenges and like roadblocks to implementing natural nature-based flood risk management. But I think if we want to pick one, challenge, the one that I would pick is our entrenchment in those older traditional methods, conventional flood risk management methods, which are heavily biased towards hard engineering. Because in policy sciences, there is this phenomenon that we call the policy path dependence, right? So when we introduce a certain set of choices in governance or design and implement them, they create more conditions for similar methods to be taken up in future as well. What we call they create a kind of self-reinforcing effect. And so throughout from mid 19th century to late 20th century, there was the flood management was heavily focused on building dams, dikes, lock gates, pump houses, and so on. And the money was pumped into that. The political establishment gained a faith on those systems, and because they were promoted, there was this false sense of security built in communities on those systems. And more importantly, they went into institutions like standards, codes of practice, and municipal bylaws, and so on. So these things are very stubbornly entrenched in our education systems, governance systems, and popular thinking as well. So I think the biggest challenge is to change that, to challenge them in governance, in education, and say, hey, there are some other methods as well. We have to take them in combination, right? So that I think that's a big challenge, because we are talking about a system which has entrenched these methods for over a century now. So I think that's what we are trying to address in our own small way, like being just a environmental organization, right? Through the flood green guide. That's why we try to make it as structured as possible, and that's why we target mid-level decision makers, because institutional entrenchment, educational systems, they are actually handled by the mid-level decision makers rather than the high-level, policy, politicians or policymakers. So that's my long answer to your short question.
All right. And I do agree with that, we as societies, we have somehow become entrenched with the older and more traditional methods. And here in the Philippines, for example, just last year in 2020, we had Typhoon Ulysses, and that kind of resulted in widespread flooding everywhere, even in the rural areas like Cagayan de Oro. And one of the suspects to that is the dam in that area that was that had a failure in controlling the water levels. So I think that kind of reflects on our dependency on these dams and these structural methods. So,
and to add to that, Ria, I think at the heart of this defaulting to hard structural methods is the basic separation that we make between humans and nature. We think that we are above nature. We forget that we are also biological beings. We're vulnerable to the elements. So much so that when, we're willing to decimate forests to build certain structures that are beneficial to humans. We are willing to destroy mangroves in the name of job creation. And, when we're willing to do these things, we also have to examine the logic of those arguments, because how safe will our health be? How safe will our jobs be if the environment in which these things are embedded just ceases to exist? So, and you know, as Misaka mentioned, this needs to be unsettled in different spaces, in policy, in education, and so forth.
And if I may add one quick
Go ahead, sir.
point, if it's okay, Ryan?
Yes,
To
go ahead, sir.
what Pamela just said, like that's a really an important point, the dichotomy between human communities and nature. It's actually not true. It's just one, right? It's on our minds that it's divided. So, I mean, but there's an additional difficulty when it comes to dealing with environmental processes like floods, rather than when compared to conserving things which are viewed as, they are not stationary, but people tend to view them as more stationary, like conserving a forest, right, or a lake system or whatever. It's very difficult. It's very easy nowadays, in the least, people to understand we should conserve forests, right, or for that matter, even a wetland system or a lake system, because they can see it. It's there. You know, its boundaries are somewhat definable and so on. So if somebody talks about cutting down even like 2 hectares of a old growth forest, like there would be a lot of people up in arms. Even our professionals, our own breed can understand that, right? No engineer would now ever, propose like cutting down an old growth forest, right? But when it comes to environmental processes, like ecological processes like floods, which had been happening for millions of years, right? We don't think twice about, oh, we have to stop that flood, right? And they can be as ecologically critical as an old growth forest, right? Or a lake system, right? Because these things have been happening in the ecosystem and the landscape for millions of years, probably more important than an old growth forest. So like if I take an example from my part of the world, South Asia, like everyone understands the importance of protecting the upper watershed forest systems in the Himalayas, right? I mean, somebody even not from the region would understand it, right? It's very sensitive. But no one talks against all these projects, these massive dams built in India and in Pakistan to control the floods in the Indus River and the Ganges River, which had been happening, which has actually formed the landscape of the subcontinent as it is today. In a couple of decades, there had been massive hydrological changes because of the change of flooding patterns. So this is one challenge. Like, I mean, people really find it difficult to relate to ecological processes than stationary things.
Yeah. But even though it's really, although we identified those challenges, it's still well worth it to use this integrated approach. All right, so thank you very much to both of you for those insights. So we have a couple of questions coming in the chat box. So we'll start off with past president, architect Jaime Hermogenes. So he asks, in what particular way can architects most effectively contribute to solutions from your experience? All right. Why don't we start with Miss Pamela?
Okay. There's a book by a design anthropologist called Arturo Escobar. It's called Designs for the Pluriverse. And in that book are his proposals for designing a new world that addresses the problems of climate change, that addresses the problem of us constantly overlooking the ways of life of the poor and indigenous peoples. And for him, designs for the pluriverse. Pluriverse kasi we live in a world of many worlds. No? So it's not just, we don't just have to think of it in terms of the world of the government or the world of the private sector. There are other worlds that are being ignored, and we have to coexist in a way so that it's workable for everyone. And for him, architecture and urbanism is everything. And that's the book is the reason why I decided to shift from anthropology to doing a PhD in architecture. It's because for him, you know, what is architecture if not a way of experimenting how humans and non-humans can coexist together? At the heart of what architects do, that's it. It's an experiment in conviviality, in living together. So I think then there are many initiatives across the world that integrate architecture as a fundamental solution for designing new ways of living so that it's more sustainable for all of us, animals, humans, plants, materials, and everything. So yeah, for me, in short, the value of architecture is it's a way for us to experiment new ways of living, but also experiment in bringing back all old ways of living that we've forgotten and that we need to return to if we want to survive as a species.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Pam. And Dr. Misaka.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'll give a more. I think Pamela nicely kind of brought it together, the bigger picture around this, like around that question. To give like a more particular insight to it, like certain particular things that an architect, ways that an architect may be able to contribute to better take up of natural and nature-based methods. So one thing with the modern society is maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. Probably, definitely, it's a good thing for us as professionals, right? It's built on the faith, the wider community's faith on experts, right? Like when we go to a doctor, like we don't like read the Lancet magazine or medical analysis or whatever to learn about the disease that they explain, right? And to check whether whatever the medicine that is given is correct. We have a faith in that, in the doctor, right? The same way we have a faith that when an engineer designs a building, that it will stand, right? So in the same way that we have a faith when an architect designs a space or a landscape, we have a faith that it would be like a livable space, like conducive to our requirements and so on. So in that sense, I think if architects can assimilate these concepts of nature-based flood risk management, I think, and incorporate them into their designs in a way that, of course, some level of convincing would be needed, and it's important to build the awareness. But when it comes from an architect that, okay, you need a rainwater harvesting system, like let's build a rainwater harvesting system in your house. Let's dedicate a part of your land, the property for a rain garden, right? Or when you convince the mayor that, okay, let's put some swales along the roads, right? That's far easier. That sinks in far better than a person like me from WWF going and speaking to a mayor, right? So I think in a very direct way, like in a very simple way, I think that's something that's a way that architects can contribute. A lot of these systems, a lot of these methods that we discussed about, they are features of individual households. They are features of public spaces like parks and things. They are urban features, and architects have like a pretty big stake in making those decisions.
All right. Thank you so much for those answers. All right. We have another question from architect Simon Cervantes. So he asks, since a lot of policies that we've implemented are geared more towards hard engineering, what are the ways and methods to slowly revert it back into a natural approach? All right. Dr. Misaka?
Yeah, FM, I would like if you add like a anthropological or sociological perspective to what to my answer. as well. So here, I think again, looking from the perspective of an engineer, and again, who take a lot of development-related decisions in most countries. We are very used to structured ways of decision making. It's not like this large, amorphous, very creative, artistic kind of approaches. It's not very, we are not used to that, right? So all engineering decision making is, it comes through a hierarchy, right? And there are very standard methods of doing it. If you change that, you can do some research, propose a change to the standards, codes of practices, and so on. And then they would be changed, and that would be adopted by the industry, and so on. That's how it works. I'm not saying there's no innovation. There's rapid innovation, but there's this structured way of doing it. So to change that entrenchment, right? I think partly we have to adopt that structured approach, right? So look at changing standards, at developing standards and codes of practices for natural and nature-based methods as well, and also non-structural methods. Changing tertiary education to incorporate natural and nature-based methods, giving the engineers, the architects, the technical people an idea that in the same way you design engineering structures, right? In the same way you design built environment, using the same building design principles, you can actually design a wetland, right? A constructed wetland. You can actually design a swell in the same way that you design a stormwater collection system, right? You can design an upper watershed restoration project very similar to and using the same, probably the same calculations as you would when you're designing a dam, right? So when that understanding comes into them, it makes it much easier for them to relate to these methods the same way that they related to these conventional hard engineering methods. And the second thing is actually getting this idea of like costs and benefits. What we call in a way that in environmental management, the total cost accounting. Like engineers are very much used to cost benefit analysis, but only thing is what they, again, not only engineers, the architects and the technical people, right, are used to cost benefit analysis. They are very used to our BOQs, bills of quantities, and cost planning, cost engineering, and all that. But unfortunately, that cost is basically financial cost, right? Cost of materials and so on. But the translating environmental cost into this is fairly a difficult task. So I think we have to work on that as well. It's a very difficult task, but when very slowly, when it trickles down, when environmental costs starts appearing in our cash flows, in our BOQs, right, in our cost management plans, then I think it makes it much easier for them to get their head around it. Not that a lot of engineers, especially the young professionals, they are very concerned. My experience is they're very concerned about environment. Like we work a lot with irrigation engineers under them, and they were the people that we feared the most, right? Because irrigation engineers are hell-bent on dam building and canal building and all that. But we found it's very easy for them to actually make them understand these environmental issues. Only thing is, when it comes to practice, they don't have the necessary tools to do.
All right. And thank you very much, Dr. Misaka. And I think that kind of ties in nicely also with what Ms. Pam mentioned earlier about acceptability. So maybe if we could get Ms. Pam's perspective from an anthropologic perspective.
Sure. Yeah, so one interesting development in New Zealand is they granted legal personhood rights to a river. So I think this is a great stride in terms of just really integrating in society that we need other other non-humans in order for human societies to thrive, no? And so basically that river is represented by a Maori indigenous group. There are two of them, one Maori and one representative from I think the government, and together they vote on the river's behalf, and they advocate on the river's behalf. We have something like that, although it's not at the level of legal personhood. But for example, in protecting Tanyon Strait from oil exploration, advocacy groups mentioned, the rights of the fish, the dolphins in the area to be protected from oil exploration. So there are pockets of these kind of new ways of, I wouldn't call them new ways of thinking, because our indigenous groups already knew this from the beginning, that humans are part of nature. But at least from a policy perspective, there are wins here and there. There's also new thinking in terms of just integrating a more long-term perspective of the future. So futures thinking is increasingly being embraced in policy circles. Some conversations about futures thinking are already starting with, say, for example, the National College of Public Ad in UP. There's a Futures Thinking Society, and I think some senators are supporting that as well. There are also movements around the world in terms of transition design. So it's really long-term planning for the future. Normally, when we talk of planning, we're talking about 5 years for short-term, 15 years for long-term. But transition design is thinking 100 years down the line and making small changes here and there so that it all comes together in the next 100 years. And this isn't just, a pipe dream. There is a transition town in the UK that is already implementing transition design. So you might want to look into that. So it's really not, really disabusing ourselves of just aiming for short-term gains and empathizing, because it's easy, it's easy working in the humanitarian space. It's easy to empathize with humans who are suffering now, because you see the pictures in the media, people drowning, people living in poverty. What we need to build, and this is why futures thinking is so important, things like transition designs, we find it hard to empathize with humans who have yet to be born, the humans of the future who are going to suffer from all the wrongdoings that we're committing right now against the environment.
All right. Thank you so much, Ms. Pam. So you mentioned futures thinking. I was just thinking, what are your thoughts on disaster risk management in light of climate change? So here in the Philippines, for example, right now we're experiencing around 20 or more typhoons within a year, and in the next few years, it's probably going to increase. So, what are your thoughts on this?
So, me na muna?
Yes,
okay.
Ms. Pam.
Okay, sure. So interesting. I'm actually writing a book chapter exactly on this. And my observation, when we talk about disaster risk reduction and management, we are talking about disaster in the singular form, when actually what we're already dealing with now is disaster. So we need to shift out of that framework that we're managing one disaster at a time, because climate change, sea level rise, land subsidence is happening concurrently with typhoons, landslides. So we need a new framework for that. In the Philippine, in international policy frameworks, as well as Philippine policy frameworks, disaster risk reduction and climate change are separate policies, but there are movements right now to, for example, integrate the Paris Agreement with the Sendai. Paris Agreement, of course, is the international framework for climate change, where countries give their commitment for lowering emissions, integrating that with the Sendai framework, which is the disaster risk reduction framework globally, and the Sustainable Development Goals. So these things, we can't think of these things in silos. We have to think of them, as things that are happening concurrently. In the new book that we're developing, along with other scholars from Australia and around the world, we're trying to advance the concept of compound, cascading, and lingering disasters. So compound disasters are two unrelated disasters happening at once. Like, for example, COVID and typhoons Rolly and Ulysses. Different kinds of disasters happening simultaneously. Cascading disasters is one disaster leading to another, like the tsunami in Japan leading to a nuclear disaster. And lingering disasters are disasters that linger beyond what is typically known as the end of a disaster. So like, for example, in the humanitarian sector, when you talk about disaster recovery, that usually lasts 3 to 5 years after impact, sometimes 2 years. But, if you look at, for example, what's happening in Yolanda, there are still a lot of people who still don't have houses. How many? 7, 8 years after it happened. So that's an example of lingering disasters. And we need this new language to talk about disasters in our international policy frameworks and in our industry practice.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Pam. Perhaps you could also get Dr. Misaka's thoughts on this.
About the same climate change.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I totally, I'll build upon what Pam said. I totally agree with what she said. And especially this idea of compound disasters, not thinking of it as just one, just not limiting ourselves to, addressing this disaster and that, and moving to another one, which actually creates more risk in between, right, than actually solving. So climate change is definitely like a big challenge on top of like what was already challenging, like our traditionally understood disasters. So one, rather than trying to kind of propose solutions to how to handle climate change, I would like to bring about like a couple of issues, a couple of underlying attitudes, right, which makes it very difficult to deal with climate change. Like one is our, especially with the professionals and decision makers, right, to come the difficulty for us to come into terms with uncertainty. I mean, we, especially professionals, right, especially mid-level decision makers, there's a tendency or a myth that uncertainty can be totally eliminated, and that everything has to be worked out deterministically. And nature doesn't work in that way at all. So there's an inherent uncertainty in all the processes. We have to embrace that uncertainty, incorporate that uncertainty into our planning, right? And what we call risk-based planning, right? Like develop scenarios, and futurizing also comes as part of that, right? So we accept the fact we can't know for sure everything, but we try to develop scenarios and work around that risk. So one big problem with understanding climate change and adapting to climate change is this thought that we can actually eliminate all the uncertainties and somehow develop a set of design methods, decision support methods in the same old way, and incorporate climate change into that. I've been asked many times by water resources engineers, like young water resources engineers, young flood, irrigation engineers, like if now our, 50-year floods, 20-year floods, like the statistical methods that they use to design flood risk management, headworks, right, dams or pumping stations or something like that. Like 50-year flood is a magnitude, a flood magnitude which has a likelihood of occurring in 1 in once in 50 years, or has a likelihood of occurring, of which the likelihood of occurring in 1 year is 1 upon 50, right? So these were actually, these numbers were arrived upon using like historical data sets, and which has changed now because of climate change. And when we say a 50-year flood in 1970s, like a 50-year flood now would be of a much higher magnitude, right? So in Colombo, where I am based, a 50-year flood happens now every other year because of climate change. So now, but then the tendency is to do some number juggling and making that uncertain certain again, which doesn't work, right? We have to understand that there is an inherent uncertainty. We understand it much less because of the climate change now, rather than even what it was earlier, right? So incorporate that uncertainty into our decision making, and do risk-based scenario planning. And also, one other important term which comes in here, which actually relates to what Pamela said as well, is transdisciplinarity. I mean, we all for the last 50 years have been agreeing that one set of professionals, one set of decision makers can't make decisions for all, right? We have to engage different professionals and the community fully, right? But still, the systems we have are designed to actually bring together these different professionals, these different perspectives, the community together in one platform, but letting them be in their own silos still. So engineer things like an engineer, community member things like a community member, NGO guy as an NGO guy. They're still, fiercely protective of their silos. But then somehow there's this platform, they come, make decisions, vote, and then whatever is majority is selected, right? And then all these power issues come into play. So it's not even the majority decision which is actually taken up. Now this can't go on anymore, right? There should be like an interpenetration of these disciplines, right? Each one of us should understand the other knowledge domain, including the community. And it has actually made the development of new techniques has made it far more viable, right, than it was before, like what we are doing right now, right? Like, and a person with a civil engineering training and a person with training in anthropology working for an environmental organization, talking to a architects association of architects, right? So this can actually lead to because it is only possible because of these widespread tools that we have, especially internet communication tools and things like that. So I think we have to make the fullest use of that to make these disciplines kind of interpenetrate, and try to understand each other's disciplines better.
All right. So very important points there from Ms. Pam and Dr. Misaka about embracing inherent uncertainties and looking at disasters more as compounded and cascading disasters. So I think that's all the time that we have for now. Dr. Misaka and Ms. Pam, thank you very much for your time. Do you have any parting statements, brief parting statements to our viewers? Maybe share your the schedule of your Flood Green Guide training program.
Misaka, I'll let you handle that.
Okay, thanks, Raya. And again, like, I'll take this opportunity to thank the Architects of Philippines again for giving us this opportunity. It's again a learning experience for us, and our learning experience working with the architects. We worked with engineers a lot, but not as much as architects. So this was a learning experience for us as well. So about so we wholeheartedly encourage you to download the Flood Green Guide, engage with our website. There are a lot of learning material there as well. And our training, we have regular training programs. Right now, it's basically online. We hope that things would change to the better towards the end of this year, and we can restart our in-person trainings as well. So there are different programs in the pipeline right now. Most of them are actually focused training programs, not open for different regions, but basically region-specific and sector-specific training programs what are being organized now. But please do visit our website, and we have our Facebook and Twitter as well. So just follow us there. So when the new training programs come, we will definitely inform you. It would be notified, and they are all free. Right? Our Flood Green Guide training programs are actually free. That's a condition of USAID, who's actually funding this whole program. But we have to be selective about that makes it really necessary to have a selection process each time. And of course, we'll be if there is any request, right, for a more detailed, like in-depth training from the Philippines, and if you can actually let us know what are the exact requirements, we can try to develop like a custom-made training program for those needs. That is a possibility. This training phase of our program would be going on until late next year. So within that period, we can actually design custom programs and do it. We'll have the funding to do that. So please let us know. And I wholeheartedly encourage you to be on alert and apply for the upcoming Flood Green Guide training. Thank you.
All right. We appreciate that very much, and we definitely will check out the latest on those programs. So again, thank you so much to our two speakers. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor to have you with us today. And with that, we move on to the presentation of speaker certificates. Back to you, Architect Laline.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Architect Raya. Thank you to both of our guests. And thank you as well to our members who actively participated in the Q&A. Okay, so we will now move to the presentation of certificates. The United Architects of the Philippines Makati chapter presents this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Misaka Heteyarachi, a senior fellow of the World Wildlife Fund in USA, for participating as our keynote speaker in the online event of UAP Makati Natural Resilience with the topic Towards Nature-Based Methods in Disaster Risk Management, given this day on May 29, 2021. Certified by Architect Simon G. Cervantes, our UAP Makati Chapter President for the fiscal year 2020-2021, and Architect Abdul Rafi Deron M. Pangandaman, our UAP Makati Chapter Secretary for the fiscal year 2020-2021.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. The United Architects of the Philippines Makati Chapter is presenting the Certificate of Appreciation to Ms. Pamela Kahilig, a nature-based flood risk management trainer and associate of the World Wildlife Fund in USA, for participating as our guest speaker in this online event, UAP Makati Natural Resilience, with the topic Towards Nature-Based Methods in Disaster Risk Management. Given this day on May 29, 2021, this has been certified by Architect Simon G. Cervantes, our UAP Makati Chapter President for the fiscal year 2020-2021, and Architect Abdul Rafi Deron M. Pangandaman, our UAP Makati Chapter Secretary for the fiscal year 2020-2021.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to this community for being so open to what we have to share today. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much, Miss Pang. Thank you so much, Dr. Misaka. All
Welcome.
right, so before we proceed to the second part of the program, may we request everyone to turn on their cameras, please? All right, and flash your widest smile and hold it for around a minute. Okay, ready? Maybe call on Miss Jan so we can have the photo up. All right, so
First slide. One, two, three. For a moment. And last. Next. One, two, three. Thank you.
all right, perfect. Thank you, everyone. We got awesome participants today, actually. So we'll be having a short break before we proceed to our business meeting later. So make sure you rehydrate and you can grab some snacks perhaps. All right. So, okay. Once again, the UAP Makati chapter would like to thank the sponsor for this event, Design Armoire.